I want to welcome everyone to this afternoon's Nathan E. Cohen lecture. This lecture will be recorded. So if you know anyone who's not able to attend today, let them be in touch with me, or you can be in touch with me, and I will send you the link for the recording. We will also be posting it on the website. So throughout the program today, I will ask that folks stay muted. And if you would like to ask any questions during our Q&A, I'm going to ask you to please put them into the chat box. All right, we won't be taking, I will not be having you unmute yourselves to ask questions, so I would just like you to put any questions into the chat box. All righty. So a number of years ago when I was working in Houston, I was asked to lead some services for a conference of Holocaust survivors and their children. It was there that I reconnected with my old friend and classmate, Greg Schneider. And Greg and I received our master's degree in Jewish communal service from the Hornstein program at Brandeis University, where one of our guests today, Daniel Mariashin, also got his degree in Jewish communal service. Greg also has his undergraduate degree from Brandeis, as well as a master's in public policy from Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. He's been working for the Claims Conference since 2009. He became executive vice president of the Claims Conference in 2009. And when I heard him speak at the conference that I referred to in Houston, ever since then, I've been trying to get him to come and speak to a community that I've been working with, and I'm so glad that we finally made this happen. The work that the Claims Conference is doing may surprise you. It's more than just material claims, and it's an organization that under Greg's leadership has remained incredibly relevant for over 70 years. So it is my great pleasure now to hand the screen over to my friend Greg Schneider. Welcome, Greg, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much. So happy to be here. Thanks, Rabbi Dan. Is that what they call you, Rabbi Dan, Rabbi Aronson? I don't know.
Rabbi Dan.
Rabbi Dan, Aronson. Yeah. So as Rabbi Dan said, he and I are friends from the old country. I don't know, from 30 years ago, maybe more. And it's so nice to reconnect. But I really agreed to do this when I realized that Dan Mariashin is a member of the community, if not present today, certainly with his heart, because I know he's a big Keene guy. So anyway, I was actually started with the Claims Conference in 1995, and I became the CEO, executive vice president in 2009, right? Is that what you said? So I've certainly been there for a long time. What I wanted to do is spend the next about 50 minutes with you, talking about a bunch of different things related to compensation and restitution for Holocaust survivors. So everything that I'd like to say would probably take about 12 hours. It would be a really long seminar. We'll try and condense it. I thought we'd talk first a little bit about the history of compensation and how we got to where we are today. Number two, the things that the Claims Conference are doing today, sort of the state of Holocaust survivors and what's going on with them today. And number three, I wanted to talk about social media because I think it's so important, particularly Holocaust denial, what the Claims Conference is doing, but what's happening in general. And then four, about Holocaust education. That'll lead us into Holocaust education. As Rabbi Dan said, throughout it's a let's be an informal group. If there are any questions along the way, you can just put it in the chat, which I see, and I can relate to the questions or comments. Happy to talk about anything if you want to go in sort of a different direction. So first of all, Dan mentioned that the claims conference is about 70 years old. So in fact, we just marked our 70th anniversary since the founding of the claims conference. I want to spend a minute talking about how that actually happened, how all of this came about. In conjunction with our 70th anniversary, we're doing a number of events, including a film that we're working on together with the German government and an exhibition. The film is going to debut on April 6th. And it's finished. It's going to debut April 6th in Berlin. And then I'm sure you'll have the opportunity to see it afterwards. It's called Reckonings. We're also doing an exhibition, which will be in Jerusalem and Berlin and throughout probably in New York and Washington. And then smaller panels and pieces of it will travel around the country. So the head of the World Jewish Congress and the Jewish Agency in 1951 was a man named Nachum Goldman, the most powerful lay leader in the Jewish world. And he understood that there was great need for Holocaust survivors coming out of the DP camps, and particularly in Israel, and also for survivors who were going to be living in other countries or already were in the United States, Canada, Australia, Argentina, et cetera, to be able to put their lives together. And that emotionally, that was going to be very complex. And certainly there isn't an issue of morality, but certainly they should be given some aid financially to help them. And so he had this idea that there should be reparations, compensation, indemnification. We can talk about the words because they're all sort of, they're laden, right? They all mean different things and connote different things, and that's important. But it was extremely controversial. And what ended up happening is that there were negotiations, but to get to that point, to get to the point of the negotiations was one of the most complex actually parts. In the Jewish world, he convened a conference of then 23 of the most important Jewish organizations from around the world, and he tried to make it as diverse as possible. So on one hand, you had geographic diversity. You have organizations from Argentina, from Australia, from South Africa, obviously North America and Israel. He also wanted it to be diverse kind of religiously. So you have Aguda Israel on one side, very observant, and you have the World Union for Progressive Judaism on the other side. So it really reflected the greatest array of Jewish life at the time. And I remember this is 1951, so there really weren't representation from survivor organizations, and there weren't representation from Eastern Europe because it just wasn't feasible. But at the time, it was that attempt. And he brought all these organizations together for a conference, and eventually it became the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany. And the material part is very important because it was not about forgiveness, wasn't about seeking forgiveness, and certainly a lot of the discussion at the time was that the representatives of these organizations didn't have the right to offer forgiveness. By the way, one of those organizations, one of the 23 organizations was B'nai B'rith, one of the founding organizations, which is why I'm so close to Dan Mariashin as the CEO of B'nai B'rith. Each member organization to this day is able to send 2 representatives, which compose our board of directors. So Dan representing B'nai B'rith, Dan Mariashin representing B'nai B'rith is one of the board members. He has been a board member for a number of years and a very, very close and trusted colleague, usually together with the president, and of course, president of the B'nai B'rith changes. But it's the same with World Jewish Congress and the Joint Distribution Committee and some of the communities that I spoke about, the Jewish Agency, et cetera. Controversial, a lot of discussion, but at the end, the representatives of World Jewry felt that they didn't have the right to say no, the moral right to say no to this idea of negotiating because it would benefit survivors. At the same time, the issue was taken up in Israel. And in Israel, it was even more controversial. There were 2 main political streams of thought in Israel. One by David Ben-Gurion, who believed that it was essential that Israel enter into negotiations because they required the money. Israel at the time in 1951 was teetering on the verge of bankruptcy. They literally didn't have the money to, just having come out of the war, establishing the country, there was no economy basically, and they had to absorb hundreds of thousands of immigrants, both from North Africa that were coming and Holocaust survivors. Neither group came with anything, with any assets. So there were hundreds of thousands of people that had to be absorbed. They needed the money. On the other side was Menachem Begin, who was more of an ideologue and believed firmly that the idea of sitting down with Germany, with the perpetrators of the Holocaust, was an abomination that we could never, ever forgive or forget, and agreeing to sit in the room with them was evil, basically. And this eventually came to a vote at the Knesset. And the day before the vote at the Knesset, there was a demonstration which turned into a riot. And actually, it's the only time in the history of the State of Israel that there's been a riot at the Knesset. The police eventually had to use tear gas. And the people talk about on the floor of the Knesset during the debate, they could smell the tear gas. And by a very slim margin, it was approved. So now you had world Jewry approving it and the State of Israel approving that go to negotiations. Now the issue was, what about Germany? It was equally controversial, or maybe the most unpopular in Germany. And we actually now, because we're doing all this research, given the 70th anniversary events, I actually found a survey from the early 1950s, 1951 or I think 52, where the German population was surveyed and 12% of the population was in favor of compensation. At that point, the German population, I mean, if you've ever seen pictures of bombed out Berlin or Dresden or, the cities of Berlin, it was totally devastated. And the German people felt that they didn't have the ability to pay. So controversial, but in the end, Konrad Adenauer, who's the first chancellor of West Germany, of course, all of this was with West Germany. East Germany was not open to any negotiations, eventually agreed. And after about 9 months of negotiations, which were very complicated and broke down, and just what you can imagine, very raw and tense. There was a final agreement, and that led to the first, it's what's called the Luxembourg Agreement. The negotiations could not be held in Germany. There were many death threats, mostly against the Jewish participants. And what happened is that in the morning, the government of Israel and the government of Germany negotiated. Then there'd be a lunch break. And in the afternoon, the government of Germany negotiated with the representatives of the claims conference for outside. So there are just so many things that are unique about this. First of all, you never have a time where a government is negotiating with an NGO. It's odd to have parallel negotiations where the Israelis and the claims conference met in the evenings in coordinated positions and were ready for the next day. And also, one of the things that we pointed out is that in 1952, when these negotiations were happening, it was, again, West Germany, the government of West Germany, the government of Israel, and the claims conference. None of those three entities existed. They were talking about things that happened when none of those three organizations existed. So, of course, Israel was founded in 1948, and Germany, again, at the same thing, and the claims conference only founded in 1951. So the negotiations, our side refused to speak German, even though every single member of the committee spoke German and understood German. They absolutely would not speak German. There were lots of starts and stops, but ultimately there was a negotiation that led to what's called the BEG. In German, it's an acronym for the Bundesentschädigungsgesetz, which is translated as Federal Indemnification Law. And it was in Germany then enacted laws in implementation of those agreements that provided to Israel goods and services over a period of years. So the ports in Israel, the electrical grids, the rails, the system was all built with money from this agreement. And the idea that Holocaust survivors could receive compensation. And it was pretty limited and it was pretty narrow as to which survivors were entitled and how much money they could get and how they had to apply. But that's what happened in the 1950s and 60s. And throughout the 50s and 60s, the claims conference, the sole purpose of the claims conference was to negotiate for liberalizations to those laws to make sure that they were being enacted fairly. And it was the German government that administered the program. So if you're a survivor and you wanted to receive compensation, you applied to the German government. They sent a German doctor. You had to be interviewed, prove your case that you were there and there was damage to health, and then you could get the pension. Many people were turned down. The claims conference was also given actually some funds for relief, resettlement, and rehabilitation, which the claims conference used at its own discretion. And part of the money was used to found Yad Vashem. The first building at Yad Vashem was funded 50% by money from the claims conference through this agreement, and lots of other projects to help survivors and also rebuild Jewish life in Western Europe. So if you go in previously occupied Western Europe, so if you go anywhere in France and Belgium, in those countries, the Netherlands, and you look at a synagogue, a school, a mikveh, any of the Jewish organizations that exist today, you will most likely in the basement of those organizations find a plaque that says renovated in 1954 with the aid of the claims conference, et cetera. It was one of the main projects. Okay. Among the people who could not be compensated were survivors who were living in Eastern Europe. Because they were living behind the Iron Curtain at the time, the West German government would not provide money to survivors living in the East, with the idea that the communist governments of Russia, the Soviet Union, Poland, Romania, Hungary, etc., would confiscate the hard currency and it would be used to fight the Cold War. So West Germany wasn't going to fund the enemy. Everybody understood that. But what happened in the late 70s, as probably most people on the Zoom will remember, there was Jackson Vanik and this whole attempt to free Soviet Jewry. And particularly in 1979, there were huge numbers of Soviet Jews that came out of the Soviet Union. And amongst them were survivors, people who had survived the Holocaust. When they were behind the Iron Curtain, they weren't entitled. By the time they came out, the deadline had passed. The deadline for all of these BEG programs was 1969, which you can understand. It was established in 1952, so it was 17 years. It was a long time for people to apply, but only for people living in the West. So when people came out a decade later in 79, they were out of luck, and it was no fault of their own. They couldn't get behind, and they couldn't get when they came out. So the claims conference went back to the German government and said, you have to reopen the BEG and allow these people. And the German government said, we've dismantled our administration for these programs a decade ago. Absolutely not, we won't do it. And the claims conference refused to give up. And there was more than a year of negotiations. And in the end, the German government said, we'll give you claims conference money, but you have to administer it and you have to provide it directly to the survivors. Now, the claims conference said, absolutely not. We were founded in 1951. The 50s, the 60s, the 70s, literally 30 years have gone by. Our organization has negotiated, but we've never administered claims. It's your responsibility. The German government said, either you do it or there'll be no money. And so despite the best efforts of the claims conference to get the German government to reopen their programs, we did not succeed in that, but we did succeed in getting Germany to agree to fund the programs through us. It was I know this is being recorded, but I don't want to be quoted anywhere. It was probably the worst mistake that the claims conference ever made. Because what it means is that for the first time, survivors were applying to the claims conference, to the Jewish nonprofit organization. And the claims conference had to prove that the person was in fact entitled, that they were eligible. And if they weren't eligible, the claims conference has to be the one to say no. It's on claims conference stationery. It's under my signature that we reject someone. Or we have to say, we don't have enough proof that you were in this place or that place as you allege, and we have to continue the negotiation. But that's how it was. And every compensation program since 1980 has worked in that way. The money comes to the claims conference, and the claims conference administers the programs. During the course of the many decades since, in the 90s and the 2000s particularly, there have been many, many liberalizations to the programs, who's entitled and who's eligible and who can get and the amounts. And to this day, this shocks people, to this day, we still have annual negotiations. It's a big part of what I do in the past 12 years, is prepare for the negotiations that we have. We make a list of demands for the year. We bring them to the German government. We negotiate with the finance ministry. And we say, we want to increase the amount of pensions. We want to add a new pension program. We want to, et cetera. So there was a kind of a watershed moment when communism fell throughout all of the countries of Eastern Europe for many, many reasons. One, the reunification of Germany gave us the opportunity to go to the unified Germany and say, West Germany has paid, but East Germany has not provided compensation for survivors. So, a third of the country has never actually provided compensation, and you have to. So it turns out that there were about a month, maybe 2 months, when the East Germany was going to be a democratic government. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, East Germany was going to remain a separate country. It was going to be a democracy. And during that time, the Claims Conference went to the East German government, that new East German government had negotiations, and the East German government agreed that it would provide compensation to survivors. As I said, it was, I think, a month, I can't remember, maybe 6 weeks, that the West German mark was introduced in East Germany, and the whole economy collapsed, and then the Germany's decided to unify. At the time of the unification, the new unified government was then stuck with this agreement that East Germany had made, the new democratically elected East Germany, and so had to fulfill it. And this, I guess, raises 2 or 3 themes. It identifies 2 or 3 themes that I want to talk about. One is ultimately what happened is that there was something called the 4+2, right? So the 4+2 are the occupying powers. So you have the 4 occupying powers: the United States, England, France, which is what became West Germany, and Russia, Soviet Union, which became East Germany. That's the 4, and the two Germanys. There was an agreement that allowed the country to unify into one Germany. In that reunification agreement of Germany, under Article 2, there is a provision that says we will enter into negotiations with the Claims Conference for funding for survivors, blah, blah, blah. And because it was in the Article 2 of the reunification treaty, we have a pension program called the Article 2 Fund. So if you know any survivors, you know the Claims Conference, we often talk about the Article 2 program, but people don't realize that it's actually connected to the Article 2 of the actual unification agreement. And again, it underscores for me, one of the things that I think is most fascinating, and one of the reasons that I love working at the Claims Conference, is the intersection between world events and survivors and the Jewish people, and in our case, compensation. So the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fact that there were thousands of survivors, tens of thousands of survivors who were living behind the Iron Curtain, and then came out, created a whole, now I'm going to call it an opportunity, but a whole new avenue of work for the Claims Conference and new opportunities for Holocaust survivors. The reunification of Germany allowed this whole new pension program, which over 120,000 Holocaust survivors eventually became eligible for that Article 2 fund and its companion in the East, of whom almost 50,000 are still alive today. So even today, we're paying pensions directly to almost 50,000 people because of this Article 2 agreement. It also opened up, the fall of communism, all those countries also opened up archives for the first time. So that had a big impact in our understanding of what really happened in many places and our ability to prove suffering for particular people, persecution. And then also there's a whole separate thing that we're probably not going to have time to talk about today, which is property restitution, the return of property. So it also opened up the whole idea that if there was a Jew who owned property, and the Jew was murdered, or was put in a ghetto and then sent to a concentration camp, and eventually, even if they're still living, eventually ended up in the United States or Israel or Canada, wherever. What happened to the house that they owned? What happened to their immovable asset? That would be a house or property, or their movable asset, or their movable asset, which would be art or insurance or bank accounts, etc. So if you lived in West Germany, these issues were resolved in the 1950s, or at least addressed in the 1950s. But if you lived in East Germany, of course, it became part of communist East Germany, where the state owned everything. It was nationalized. Nobody owned any private property. So those issues only became relevant in the early 1990s. And the law, as we were able to negotiate it, is that if the original owner was still alive, he had the right to get it back. And if he was dead, then any heir could get it back. But we knew that there were thousands and thousands of Jews who were murdered and who had no heirs. But from Tanakh, Rabbi Dan can talk to us about this. Ratzachta v'gam yarashta, that you can't murder and then inherit. That was our position. So normally, if a person is a member of society and then they die, there's the concept in the law of eschit, that the state inherits. But in this case, we made the point that it would be immoral. You murdered your own citizen, and then you're going to still steal their property. So if there is no original owner or heir, the claims conference is able to claim the property in the name of the Jewish people. And that's what we did in East Germany throughout the 90s. And we recovered probably more than $2.5 billion. In fact, the process is still going on. If you can imagine it, we're down to the last probably 3 or 4% of claims, and the money is now very small. And we use that money to provide home care and food and a whole range of welfare services for the poorest of Holocaust survivors. That's what the money that we recovered from the property. There are also legal issues. Let me spend another 5 minutes on this whole area of compensation. So let me give you an example of a legal issue, or how, it's a mix of money and morality and legal issues and political. So remember I said one of the themes before that emerges is this idea that we are interconnected with big global events, what's happening in history, the fall of communism, and et cetera. Another important theme throughout of this is that at every stage, at every negotiation, for every single penny that has been negotiated, the US government, whether Republican or Democrat, irrelevant, the US government has been the greatest friend of Holocaust survivors. Not only did they, together with the Russians and others, liberate camps, not only did they give safe haven to so many Holocaust survivors, but throughout the years, it has been the American government, mostly the State Department, that has been incredibly helpful in these negotiations. And that is true until today. And just recently, for instance, I could tell you that under the Trump administration, they were incredibly helpful. We have expanded the scope of the aid, not only to the State Department, which is helpful for the embassy in Berlin, or it used to be in Bonn, but also to the Treasury Department, because as I said, we negotiate with the finance ministry in Germany, and that's the interlocutor. Secretary Liu under Obama, he was the Treasury Secretary, incredibly helpful. Secretary Kerry when he was at the State Department, Secretary Pompeo under Trump. In fact, during I can't remember now, I think it was in Singapore that he was having negotiations. Trump and Pompeo were meeting with Kim Jong-un. I think it was Singapore, I can't remember. In the midst of those meetings, they took a break, and we had prepared a letter for Pompeo to send to his counterpart in the German government, which he did, and he signed the letter, and he sent it in between, those negotiations, because it was our negotiations were that week as well. So Mnuchin, Secretary Mnuchin of the Treasury has been incredibly helpful. Sometimes we have groups of leadership in the Senate or the Congress that deal with their counterparts in Germany. Again, I just want to emphasize this theme that American government, whichever party, strongly supports everything that we do. It's probably a big piece of how we're able to achieve what we have. We realized about 15 years ago that although we were recovering money from the property and using it for home care for survivors, the need for home care would far exceed the amount of money that we would recover from these properties. And so we started talking to the German government about this need. And 15 years ago, they provided the first funding. Now remember, this is a 70-year endeavor. So it means in year 55, after 55 years of never providing anything for food or medicine or home care directly, they started. Again, I think a pretty remarkable achievement, because even at that time, they were saying, we're at the end, isn't it enough? Why would we have to enter into a new category, a new area? But they did in a very small amount, which at the time, I believe was 6 million euros. That 6 million euros we negotiate every year increases. Now, of course, the number of Holocaust survivors decrease every year because Holocaust survivors die. They're not replaced, they're not replenished. However, the people who need home care, the number of people from amongst those Holocaust survivors who are living increases, and the amount of home care, the number of hours they need, increases. And so we are still 15 years later at a point of increase. So every year for the past 15 years, the amount of money that we've negotiated from the German government has increased. As I said, it started with, let's say, $10 million approximately. Last year, it was about $670 million. And this year, it'll be $750 million. Which is just spent on welfare services for Holocaust survivors. So as you can see, although every year the number of the total number of survivors decreases, the percentage among them who require aid and the amount that those require is still increasing. We estimate that that will probably be another year or two until it peaks. It plateaus for about 2 years, and then it decreases pretty rapidly. So we are still negotiating. I mean, people find this shocking, but we are still negotiating increases every single year. Now, it's the same thing in this idea of compensation. And here I mentioned before the legal issues. I want to talk about the legal issues. Let me give you an example. A person, according to the law, dating back to 1952, a person is compensable. We are able to pay them. You know, there are lots of rules and lots of different programs, but conceptually, if a person was on the territory of Nazi-occupied, first of all, Nazi Germany or Nazi-occupied Germany, territory that was occupied by Nazi Germany, or on territory which was subsequently occupied by the Nazis. So it means if you were living in Germany, it's clear, or Austria, it's clear. If you were living in Poland, it's clear because the Nazis occupied Poland. If you were living in Belarus, it's also clear because you were living in Minsk, the Nazis came and occupied that territory. And if you fled from Minsk, which is what happened for many, many people, Russian-speaking Jews fled, right? So the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads, moved forward. The army, moved forward, and just behind them were these killing squads that gathered the Jews, made them dig a pit, and machine gunned them down, or put them in the back of a truck and put the hose with the gas and killed them right there, right? Not unlike Poland, where first they created ghettos. It was very, very rare, less common that they did it in Russia and Ukraine and Belarus. More likely they killed people on the spot, or people fled. But if they fled from territory that was subsequently occupied, they're also entitled to some compensation. They don't receive a pension, but they receive a one-time payment, right? So you have this legal construct of Nazis, territory that was occupied by the Nazis, that you lived under Nazi occupation, or that you fled from territory that was subsequently not occupied. I see that there's some questions. I'll come to them in a second. Feel free to keep sending. The problem is, we were looking then at Jewish survivors from Leningrad, right? So the siege of Leningrad, if you know your history, the Nazis surrounded the city and starved them out. There was no food, there was no oil for heating, and it was horrendous, awful, horrendous suffering. But if you listen to the legal definition, it was never occupied. So it's not that any of those Jews lived under Nazi occupation, and it's not that they fled from territory that was subsequently occupied. It was literally never occupied. So if you were living in Leningrad, you don't meet any of the legal definitions, even going back to 1951. So it's only about 10, 12 years ago that we were able to get the German government to agree that there would be a carve out for people who were living in Leningrad. Now they're able to, about 10 years ago, they're able to receive a one-time payment. And today, actually, about 6 months ago, we agreed with the German government that now they're entitled to a pension. So this is an example of issues that we have continually to negotiate. I have many more of them, but let me stop here and answer some of the questions. One, has the German government ever put a monetary cap or time limit on the claims? Yeah, that means on the ability for a person to apply. That's what you mean, right? I'm assuming that's what you mean. So the answer is yes. Just like I said, under the original program for the BEG, there was a deadline of 1969. Since then, there have been probably 6 or 7 different programs. So remember I said that because of 1979, so many Jews came out. So in 1980, something was created called the Hardship Fund. So that has been open since 1980. It's still open today. So that's been 40 years. The Article 2, there is no deadline. Later years, we created a Child Survivor Fund, which is an additional payment. So for most of those programs, there haven't been, but there are. To recover the property, because this wasn't just about compensation, this is about creating clear title to properties, which is required in order for development, right? Like if you think about Berlin, if anyone's ever been to Berlin 20 years ago and today, you wouldn't even recognize them, right? They're totally different places. It used to be West Berlin was beautiful and East Berlin was incredibly dilapidated. Then after the fall of communism, East Berlin became developed. And so now if you see a new building, sparkly, shiny, new, beautiful building, it's ironically in the East. and the West kind of looks old and dated. But anyway, in order to do all of that development in the East, there had to be clear title, which means these issues had to be resolved. So there was a deadline for those. My parents and grandparents were born in Germany. Both grandfathers were German army officers in World War II. Yes. 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 I mean, do you know how many times I hear the story? We were good Jews. We didn't think this. I mean, we were good Germans. We were Jews. This was our country. There were so many Jews in our community that were lawyers and doctors. And, we never imagined this could have happened, which is why I say all the time, be careful of what we see today, right? Although I am a very, very proud American, every time I say that, I do remember literally hundreds of people that I've heard say to me, we were such proud Germans. Okay. No in total means, have they ever put a monetary cap on the total amount that they will give in compensation? So the answer is no. At every negotiation, even to this day, they say, okay, we will agree to X. We will now pay pensions to survivors from Leningrad, but this ends our negotiations. We're done. Schluss, finished. Sof Pulad here. To which we say, thank you. We accept the compensation for Holocaust survivors from Leningrad. We'll see you next year. So we don't. It's the same concept with Article 2. When Article 2 was established, which I said ultimately paid recognized and paid 120,000 survivors, then the criteria were much smaller, were much more narrow. And it's sort of this idea of salami tactics. If you look at the minutes from the meetings in the early 90s, when this was being discussed at the claims conference, before I was there, when I was hanging out in Waltham with Dan, they spoke about our board, the claims conference board, spoke about how could we possibly accept this compensation program, which would benefit at the time, it was estimated to be 25,000 Holocaust survivors. How could we accept that? Because we know that there are thousands more that deserve compensation. But after 18 months of negotiating with the German government, this is the best we're going to get. So on the other hand, how do we have the moral right to say no for those 25,000 people? And then the answer is, the solution has always been for the claims conference to say, yes, we will make an agreement. We will accept the compensation for the 25,000 people. We'll start paying to them. But we're telling you now, we're coming back to negotiate for the further liberalizations. And that has happened every single year. And every year there's been an increase. From Dan, Greg, can you tell about the claims conference efforts to support Holocaust remembrance and research? I certainly can. So kind of finishing up, because we have about 20 minutes left, right? Kind of finishing up this issue of compensation. We are now at the point where we have paid last year, every single Holocaust survivor is entitled to some payment last year. Some people get pensions, some people get one-time payments, but at least every single survivor was entitled to something. That's number one. And number two, any survivor anywhere in the world who needs home care is entitled to receive home care. I am receiving them. I only received from Dan through you. The others I received directly. Oh no. It seems to be a mix. Not sure. I'm not sure the answer to that. You can forward them. We provide food, we provide medicine, we're providing home care, but we know that at every month, a survivor who's perfectly fine today will fall and break their hip and need home care in an instant. They'll need it tomorrow. And so although there are no waiting lists today, or very minimal, it could easily come that throughout the course of the year there will be. And so we are constantly negotiating for liberalizations. Okay, I want to just get into the idea of Holocaust remembrance and education, but I want to start by talking about Facebook. So here I actually have a few moments of a PowerPoint. Let's see if I can figure out how to do this. Oh wait, I need to share sound. Yeah. All right, so are you guys good seeing this? Yeah, okay. Okay, we did a campaign called #NoDenyingIt, and I just want to talk for a few minutes about how we got there. It started, actually the way it really started is that Mark Zuckerberg gave a press conference. He gave an interview, and he was talking about the Rohingya, and he was talking about Facebook's failure or failure to stop being complicit in the genocide. And he said, out of nowhere, no one asked a question about the Holocaust, about the Holocaust. He said, it's not like the Holocaust where some people just get it wrong, some people just make a mistake, which we would never take down, we never correct. And I was so horrified because I really hadn't thought about Facebook and Holocaust denial on Facebook. I mean, it was a couple of years ago, but why did he go out of his way to say it? And so we brought a few Holocaust survivors. You see them there, Yehuda, Roman Kent, and Aaron Krell. We brought them to Facebook and we started to talk on Facebook about this issue about Holocaust denial. And I said, what Mark Zuckerberg is saying, that some people get it wrong, is just wrong. Holocaust denial is deliberate. It is intentional. It is the intent to suggest that the Holocaust is made up or exaggerated by Jews for some benefit, maybe financial benefit, sympathy, political advantage for Israel. I have no idea. But Holocaust denial is not someone getting it wrong. It is deliberate and it is hate speech. And you have to recognize it as hate speech, which would then force Facebook to under its community standards, remove it. So we met with some people at Facebook several times. And if I want to be just candid about it, they just blew us off. They just didn't take it seriously. We hear you, the issue is very important, we'll escalate it, we're thinking about it, blah, 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 nothing. That went on literally for 2 years. Then we decided to do a campaign, and this is the...
I lost all my family.
Most of my family was murdered.
I was witness to thousands of Jews being deported to Treblinka and Auschwitz.
And I was there when the Nazis took over our home and beat my father almost to death.
There was only one time when I was with another child during the war. And later on, that little boy was killed in front of me.
None of my classmates nor my friends survived the war.
I'm a Holocaust survivor who survived Auschwitz, Sachsenhausen, and Mauthausen.
When people post that the Holocaust did not happen, they are saying that my father, sister, and 60 people of my family were not murdered by the Nazis.
People who say that the Holocaust did not happen are actually calling me a liar. My fellow survivors and I are not liars. We are witnesses.
Mark Zuckerberg
Remove the Holocaust deniers from Facebook.
No, there is no denying it. The Holocaust was real. I know, because after we disembarked from the cattle car, my mother, my father, and my twin sister, Sabina, were sent immediately to the death chamber.
There is no denying it.
There is no denying it.
There's no denial that the Holocaust did happen.
So we started the social media campaign with these videos, and we released one video every day until Mark Zuckerberg would agree to take down Holocaust denial. And then part of it was to amplify the campaign. So it's kind of hard to see, but you see their number of congressmen, and Governor Murphy is the governor of New Jersey, who we happen to have a close relationship with because he used to be the ambassador in Berlin. Jamie Raskin, whatever, a number of congressmen and senators retweeted our campaign to try and get more traction. Of course, many organizations here, you see IRA and the Auschwitz Memorial and whatever, et cetera. So there are a number of stories. You see it, AP, ABC. We just pulled a few examples. So you see it, Deutsche Welle, which is the main news outlet in Germany, et cetera. So anyway, day 75, we issued another video, as we had done one video, 1 or 1.5 minute video every single day of a Holocaust survivor telling our story. Again, partnering with Holocaust institutions, partnering with political figures. There were certainly some figures in entertainment like Mayim Bialik and a number of other people retweeting, maybe Deborah Messing, et cetera. And on day 75, they changed course. And they agreed. Now, at the same time, there were other organizations, the American Jewish Committee and World Jewish Congress and ADL were working on this as well. But on day 75 of our campaign, and I know for a fact that Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg and the most senior people at Facebook knew about it, were offended because you saw that it's very personal, right? It's Holocaust survivors saying directly into the camera, Mark Zuckerberg, take down Holocaust denial. So eventually they changed course on day 75 and they agreed that Holocaust denial would be recognized as hate speech and therefore, according to their community standards, has to be brought down. And this was the notice that they put, the post that they put to Facebook saying that they would do that. So one of the things that was interesting in the specific post that Zuckerberg put up and Sheryl Sandberg was that they referenced something that we had done earlier, which was a survey about Holocaust awareness and knowledge. So again, the claims conference, the focus of the claims conference is compensation, right? Is getting pensions and payments for individual Holocaust survivors. And then it expanded 15 years ago to welfare benefits, home care, food, medicine, anything to take care of survivors. But as you know what, I went to a funeral this morning and somebody was asking me at the funeral, what's the future of the claims conference? And I said, what's important to survivors is what's important to us. And overwhelmingly, survivors are talking about Holocaust education. Who will remember us? Who will tell our stories? I remember the shtetl that I came from, but when I die, that's the last connection. So who's going to remember? So we felt that we really needed to take this on. So we did the survey, and I'm just going to show you a few of the slides. The connection was that in Mark Zuckerberg's post about why they were taking down Holocaust denial, he actually even references this claims conference survey. So we've done two in the United States. One was in general, and a few years later, we did a state by state. So we looked at results for each individual state of millennials and Gen Z. So just to give you some of the highlights, but I can show you where it is on our website, and you can go look yourselves because it's really fascinating. Is people who do not know that 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust, 63%. And 36%, in other words, a third of all US millennials and Gen Z didn't believe or know thought that it was less than 2 million Jews who had been killed during the Shoah. So I thought it was really interesting. Not that any specific data point is so critical. Like if you think it's 4 million, 5 million, 6 million, does it really matter in the big scheme? Might some people say. But I thought it's so interesting, particularly in the Jewish community, 6 million is so sacrosanct, right? If someone says to me in the context of something totally else, 6 million, blah, 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 I am already thinking 6 million triggers my connection to Holocaust. But for most Americans, it just doesn't. It's like the things that we thought were the most important things. Familiarity with concentration camps. Can you name or do you know what concentration camps? And you can see, no. We asked about distortion, particularly online. I have seen Holocaust denial distortion online, 50%, right? So half of all millennials and Gen Z have seen something about the Holocaust didn't happen, it's not true or whatever online, which makes it so important to focus on social media and online education. And then this one relates specifically to state by state. So if you go to our website, which is claimscon.org, if you go, today at the bottom, if you scroll down or you click on the thing that's on the link that says about Holocaust awareness survey, we have certain questions. So this one is can't name a concentration camp or ghetto, and then for every state you see the percentage. So 45% of millennial and Gen Z in New Hampshire cannot name a single concentration camp or ghetto. But if you look at Wyoming, it's 38%. So residents, millennials and Gen Z in Wyoming know more, if you want to extrapolate, very broadly from this one question, are doing better than the population in New Hampshire. And for us, there were results. Obviously, I wasn't looking at Wyoming versus New Hampshire, but we were looking at New York as an example, right? And New York did particularly poorly. Like some of the states where we think large populations of Jews and large populations of survivors, and you would think would know more about this, actually did not do as well. So you might be interested, if you go to the website, you can click on it. I think there's one more. You can click on it. Yeah, this was about did not knowing the 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. So you can go and you can look for a whole range of questions, how your state did. And the result of this, what's been really important for us, is that this has really raised the question of Holocaust education. What's working? Where does it happen? There are mandates in certain states, whether it's a state law that it's required. And it turns out that there's actually may not be a connection, or there might even be an inverse connection between having a mandate and the results of the survey. So we're working very closely with the people in Washington, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and a lot of other Holocaust education institutions across the country. Some of the people in Washington believe that teachers who are so overwhelmed resent the idea of a mandate. It doesn't mean that they don't want to teach. It doesn't mean that they aren't. But for those states, it might actually be for some states, it might actually be counterproductive. But the idea that we get attention to these surveys means that more people are talking about it. And the one thing that we know for sure is that Holocaust education, or all education in the United States, is very, very local. It's not on a federal, national level. It's not really even on a state level. It's school district by school district. This is a fight that we're going to have district by district. And when I say fight, I don't mean fight against people who are against it. Because one of the things you see in the survey, that over 90% of people believe that Holocaust should be taught in schools. It's not that people are against it being taught. It's that we haven't aligned what we do with what we say is important. So we have to provide funding. We have to provide teacher training. We have to give teachers, who are the heroes in this story, where no one's bashing teachers, but we have to give them the tools to be able to properly educate about the Holocaust. Okay, so let me take it off this. Okay, maybe there's some more questions. Can you tell about the Claims Conference efforts to support Holocaust? Yeah, we just did that. A family was on the St. Louis and returned to Europe. Mother's family had bakery stalls still now operating. My gosh, now very valuable art book, but when is it going to end? Separate question, is the organization offensive in Germany? Interesting, offensive in Germany. So when I was in college, I used to be the college representative for UJA. And I used to go to, like, in a dorm and knock on a door and ask another, like a college student, do you want to give to UJA? And all my friends were like, how can you do that, right? Why do you want to go do that? And how can you ask for money? And I used to say, I'm not asking for money. I'm giving them the opportunity to do something that they want to do and that they think is right. If they don't want to give money, they're going to say no. But I'm making it easier for them, giving them the opportunity to participate, in this case, do a mitzvah, give some money to UJ, etc. It's kind of the same thing here. If Germany really doesn't want to give, they're not going to. But we do everything we can to apply pressure. So obviously, when you have the Treasury of the Secretary of the Treasury and the Secretary of the Secretary of State and maybe the Vice President or even the President mention it at a G8 meeting, try and do whatever we can. And we try and get Holocaust survivors to pressure governments in Canada and in Australia and whatever. So Germany feels the pressure from lots of different places. And we use the media where we can, and we use moral suasion. And, one of the things is we always used to have the negotiations in the past decades in Germany. And when I started, I said, let's take it out of Germany. Let's have it in Israel. Let's have it in Washington or New York. And so we bring Holocaust survivors, we bring German government officials into the homes of Holocaust survivors in Borough Park and have them sit bedside and have them hold the hand of a Holocaust survivor as the survivor tells their story. That changes the whole dynamic, because now you're dealing with a person and what's happening with that person, and they understand why that person needs home care. Is the name offensive? So I'll come to that. So we try and humanize it as much as possible. We try and focus it on why this is not, we can't let it be portrayed as rich American Jews who are trying to take money, right? That's kind of in Poland, where we're working on property restitution, that's the way they try and frame it. And what we try and do is provide the truth, which is Holocaust survivors, a third of all Holocaust survivors living in the United States are living in poverty. And if you're living in Ukraine or Russia, where there's still 35,000 Holocaust survivors, you need help. So we try and focus on those people. Is the name offensive? The name is not offensive because we say it. Well, first of all, now it's just called the Claims Conference. Interestingly, in Germany, it's called the JCC, the Jewish Claims Conference, Jüdische Claims Conference. So most people don't even get to the Jewish material claims, but they don't have a problem with that because they know that we are not asking for forgiveness. We're not asking them for anything other than to help survivors live their lives in dignity at this point. I don't think the name is offensive. I think other people might feel when we get a property back, that might be more offensive on some cases, but no, but not the name. Okay, I don't know. I'm happy to. This was a nice introduction. Now I'm ready to launch into my 12-hour seminar. I don't know if there are other things people want to talk about. We haven't even spoken about looted art, which is a whole nother topic. We haven't spoken about, actually, Dan Mariashin could probably speak so movingly about this. The whole concept of property restitution. I spoke about it in East Germany, which was then subject to, the German unified law. And by the way, the reason that there is property in Germany, this is the property restitution in Germany, this is amazing. The original law in Germany was under US military law. Remember how I said again and again, it's the US government who's so helpful. So even before the claims conference, when in the zone that was occupied by the US military, under US military law was the first law for property restitution, which reluctantly, eventually the French adopted and the British adopted. And as I said, the Russians never did, which became East Germany until 1990. But the whole thing really started with the American government. Anyway, there is a process to try and do the same thing in the 15 or so other countries of Eastern Europe to much less degree of success. But Dan Mariashin is very, very involved with that in many countries, and the fight continues. I don't know. I'm gonna stop for a second. Any things we must talk about? Rabbi Dan, anything?
Yeah, if folks have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. You should have the choice of sending them to me or to Greg or perhaps to both of us, but feel free to put your questions in there. I want to be sure that we thank the Cohen Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College for their valuable sponsorship or co-sponsorship of this program, Greg. They've been really an important driver in requiring Holocaust education here in the state of New Hampshire. The interim director of the Cohen Center is Celia Rabinowitz, who is joining us. And I'm going to ask her to unmute and to invite Celia to say a word or two, if you'd like. Are you able to unmute yourself? Okay, just a second. Go ahead, Celia.
There we go. Thank you very much, Dan. And Mr. Schneider, thank you very much. This is very good timing. I'm not sure you know, Tom White, who is the center's coordinator for educational outreach, is on the implementation subcommittee of the state group that is working on curriculum for our state's mandate for genocide and Holocaust education. We're watching that very carefully. New Hampshire, you may know, is also a state that has an array of interesting divisive concepts laws and loyalty oath laws now in the works, so we're keeping an eye on that as well. But I ran into a faculty member in our Holocaust and Genocide Studies academic department. We offer the only undergraduate major in the United States in Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And the faculty member teaching the Holocaust course this semester was just using your survey last week. And a group of students in that class is doing a very informal, not especially scientific version of that on campus, and has already been, I think, quite shocked at the responses they're getting by visiting offices and talking with students and staff. So she's invited me to come along when the students sort of complete their work and give a presentation. And it's fairly informal, but I think the students are already very interested in your experience, and it seems to align across age cohorts with what you found. So thank you very much. This was really fascinating. I am a third generation survivor, and it was, descendant of survivors, and I'm really, really grateful for spending the time with us.
Thank you, Celia.
Yeah, first of all, let me just react. First of all, Celia, call me Greg, everybody. But I really appreciate that kind of feedback because, we're looking at the entire world, right? We're looking at what is happening in Holocaust education in Croatia. And then people say to us, you know what, we're focused, should we be doing stuff on Holocaust education in Israel or the United States? Or should we be doing it in more traditional kind of Western countries like, Croatia, England, Australia even? What are we doing in India? What are we doing in China, right? So we're partnering with UNESCO on, on education programs in certain places. There's lots of stuff at the UN. Again, Dan is far more of an expert than I am. We can talk about this, but there are lots of things that I don't agree that happen at the UN, in particular in Israel. But on Holocaust education, they're actually kind of interesting. So my point is that having people in the local community, right? People in New Hampshire, people who are working on your local school districts and your local officials and making it important in your communities is what's going to make the difference, right? It's not that anybody can tackle the whole world. For us, it's really trying to give tools and empowering people who care about this issue, which obviously all of you do. So, we're so grateful for the partnership. One of the questions was about 72 years later, why do Holocaust survivors still have unique needs? So I would like to spend about 3 hours on this issue because if I don't have any expertise on anything, but I think on this is the thing that I'm most interested in. It is amazing the unique needs of Holocaust survivors, even though they are in their 80s or 90s today. And you see it all the time. I think in general, as people age, of course, they regress, right? And they go back to their childhood. Well, if you go back to your childhood and your childhood is a concentration camp, your childhood is seeing all of your community and your neighbors and, your cousins and your family being murdered and destroyed, imagine the night terrors that you have from that. There are inherited wealth issues, God forbid when my parents die, I think, they'll leave me something, their house or I don't know, whatever, right? And there's generations of accumulated wealth that got cut off, right? That is not only about money, which is something that, you use to take care of yourself when you're in an older age, but it also is a legacy. It's a tradition. It's an intellectual. It's cultural. It's, Jewish learning. I mean, there was so much that was cut off. And so you have to be cognizant of that. And I think there are complicated relationships between survivors and children. We don't have the time to go into it today, but as you get older, and so you have a 70-year-old child who's taking care of a 90-year-old, 95-year-old adult, senior adult, imagine all of those issues. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. Again, at this funeral this morning, someone was talking to me about, I'm a second generation, I'm a child of survivors, and I have so many complicated issues. When is the claims conference? That's one of the questions we get a lot. When is the claims conference going to focus on second generation? And our answer always is, we may, I don't know, that's maybe the nightmare of the German government, but so far the needs, the direct needs of Holocaust survivors are so great that we're just focusing on that. Between the compensation that I spoke about and the home care programs that I spoke about, last year we distributed something about $1.5 billion, right? That makes us the biggest Jewish organization, but it's not sufficient to the task. There's just so many more needs: emotional, physical, psychological, medical, dental. I mean, the list just goes on. And so that's why we're still at it. Okay. Rabbi Dan, I'm happy to go on, as I've said many times, for another 2 hours, but I do want to respect everybody's time.
So I'm going to ask Dan Mariashin to say a few words, but before I do, Dan, Dan Mariashin and Greg and I are all graduates of the Hornstein program at Brandeis. I didn't know Dan Mariashin when I was at Brandeis, but Greg and I were in the same class. And I knew at the time that Greg would be a shining star in the American Jewish community. And I can't put into words what it was like to have a reunion with Greg in Houston with so many Holocaust survivors around who just adore him and are just so incredibly grateful for the work that you do, Greg, and for the work that the conference does. It was just really, really touching. And I know our friend Bernie Reisman would be looking down upon us and just felling to see the work that you've done and to see the work that Dan Mariashin has been doing and continues to do. So, Dan, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi. And I wish I could say that I was in your class. It would have been an interesting experience, but I am older than both of you. So I missed that, but it's a great program, and I think it clearly gave us all the kind of foundation that we needed to proceed in our careers. I want to be very brief. One comment about the Claims Conference survey, which Greg talked about. There was one item, and it was in one of the visuals that came up quickly on the screen, which I found to be, frankly, extremely disconcerting. It not only is there not enough knowledge about concentration camps and how many Jews were killed, but I think I saw 20. I thought it was less than that, but I saw one slide that said that 20% of these young people feel that Jews themselves contributed to the Holocaust. So we have, with so many thousands of survivors passing away each year, those people who saw with their own eyes, those people that you saw in the video, they're not going to be here, and the job really falls on us to educate. Second point, very briefly, about property restitution, because Greg referenced it. This is another big field in itself. I always thought that these post-communist governments with younger and younger leaders not connected to the Holocaust would find it easier to confront the fact that the Holocaust was not only the greatest murder in history, it was also the greatest robbery in history. And so you have post-communist governments which were inheriting Jewish properties that had been confiscated, nationalized, as Greg pointed out, by these governments after 1945. And there is no government really, save perhaps for the Czech government, which early on was able to conclude an agreement. There's no government that really hasn't willingly gone into discussions about property restitution. It's a big battle. It's a big fight. The World Jewish Restitution Organization, which B'nai B'rith is a part of, and which is very much a part of Claims Conference as well, really, I think, does important work in this area. Finally, Rabbi, you hit the nail on the head about Shining Star. The Claims Conference is a unique organization. It's totally unique. There's no other, and there shouldn't be, because we need to have one central place where this important work is done. But it is led by a totally unique individual. It can only be led by a person who is unique, and Greg is that person. And I can tell you, from the top down, from Greg down to his staff, there is this special feeling about survivors. This not only this derech eretz to survivors, but this special feeling about wanting to help. You heard it in Greg's presentation today. You heard it throughout. You have to have that feeling. This is not a 9-to-5 job. You have to feel that way. And his staff, also in the area of Holocaust remembrance, of education, of research, keeping always in mind about history, about that moment when there won't be any more survivors to point to the tattoo on their arms and say, I saw it, I experienced it, I was a victim. Once that's gone, then you saw in the Claims Conference survey, you know what kind of job we have lying ahead of us. So Greg is that person. He has tremendous respect in our field. I really would say he's one of a kind. And really, it's been a great honor to have worked with him all of these years. And something very special that he actually spoke before the congregation of Ahavas Achim because of this connection that I have. So, Greg, great job.
Okay, Rabbi Dan, you should have muted Dan like 3 minutes earlier because that was just, okay, it's a love bomb here. I'm buddies with Dan, it's all good. Dan Marish is clearly one of, I think I said it before, one of my closest and most trusted colleagues, so I appreciate. And that is the source of my love for Keene because it gave birth to him and maybe so many of you who were a part of this. I know we're concluding, but it's so important that I just talk about for one more second about this issue about social media, because I kind of mentioned Facebook, but I really wanted to talk, the fight is only just beginning. There is just so much. And I just want to give you this tiny example. Everyone knows Google, right? And Google has the thing, Google Maps. So I thought Google Maps was like you put in, this is my home and this is where I want to go. And it shows you, the fastest route. Well, it turns out that there's a whole issue about Holocaust denial on Google Maps. And like, who would have thought, right? How would you know this? So it turns out that in Google Maps, like many other things, you can write reviews. So if I put in, I want to go to Joe's Pizza down the block, people can put in a review of Joe's Pizza. The sauce is no good, So Auschwitz-Birkenau, the Memorial Center, or the Anne Frank House, or Hitler's birthplace, these are all locations. And every location can have a review. And there are people who write reviews on some of these places, on the place of Auschwitz, the most horrific things that I can't even repeat here. But basically the concept is that it's Holocaust denial and distortion and saying, it really didn't happen there. So the things that you think are the most benign, that you think have, you would never think that Holocaust denial has to be monitored on Google Maps, right? It's so crazy. And so my point is that we have to be connected with every single media company, right? Internet company. And we are now starting just the way we started with Facebook. We are with Twitter and TikTok and Google, all of them. If you type in Hola hoax, right? You don't want to get to the website of the deniers. What we want is that those people are demoted in the search, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum or the Cohen Center, some center of education is promoted so that you get to a link to a website that says Holocaust denial is the deliberate attempt to minimize the murder of the annihilation of the Jewish people, etc. So there have always been Holocaust deniers and there's always been anti-Semitism. But the internet and these platforms give a megaphone to people who maybe we're fringe, or we don't take so seriously, we don't, they're down in our bubbles, but all of a sudden, because of algorithms and the way this works, they have a disproportionate voice. And we must be vigilant and we must be in the fight. I know we're way over time, but it's just, I think it will be the area where we really have to spend going forward, if we really want to protect Holocaust memory, and make sure that there's the wide dissemination of the lessons of the Holocaust, this has to be the area that we're focused on.
Thank you so incredibly much, Greg. I have been in touch with Dan Mariashin about offering a Cohen lecture, perhaps in this spring or early next year. There are few people who have a bird's eye view of the American Jewish community, or the world Jewish community for that matter, that Dan Mariashin has. So we have a great opportunity to learn from him. I want to again thank the Cohen Center. Thank you, Celia, for being here. Thank you, Jan Cohen, for being here. I also want to thank David Kochman, whose parents are survivors of the Shoah, for participating and asking questions today. I know this is something that is very close to his heart. So Greg, we made it work, and I can't thank you enough for sharing this. And hopefully we'll have other opportunities to learn from you. We wish you blessings in your work and continued koach, continued strength as you move forward.
Thank you so much. Love being with you guys. I'm looking forward to my physical trip to Keene. Maybe Dan and I will take a road trip up, right?
Yeah, you guys should. All right.
Thank you,
So that
Cohen
is-
Center. Thank you, Rabbi Dan. Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you, Greg, and say hi to your family for me.
Thanks.
And that concludes our program. I will stop the recording.